The world for Hana, a young nurse's aide on the island of Saipan in the spring of 1944, was built on a single, unshakable truth. The American enemy was not human. They were Kichikubeihei, brutal, demonic beasts. This was not a metaphor or a piece of clever wartime rhetoric. It was a fact, as solid and real as the volcanic rock of the island itself. Every radio broadcast, every government poster, and every officer's speech painted the same horrifying picture. The Americans were giants, yes, but misshapen ones, with grotesque features, body hair like apes, and an insatiable appetite for cruelty. They were monsters who would commit unspeakable acts upon captured women before subjecting them to the most agonizing, drawn-out deaths imaginable. For Hana and thousands of other Japanese women, both civilian and military auxiliaries, this belief was the bedrock of their reality. Surrender was not an option. It was a gateway to a fate far worse than the swift, honorable death of Gyokusai, or shattering like a jewel. They were taught that to die for the emperor was the ultimate glory, but to fall into the hands of the American Oni, the devils from across the sea, was the ultimate shame and horror. This indoctrination was total, a psychological fortress designed to ensure that no one would ever break. But what happens when the monster at the door looks nothing like the monster in your head? This question was, for the women of Saipan, purely academic. The fortress of their beliefs was impenetrable because it had never been tested. The stories were too vivid, the warnings too dire. They heard tales whispered in the barracks of demonic American soldiers who filed their teeth into points, and whose laughter echoed like the screeching of ghouls. The propaganda was an art form, meticulously crafted to prey on their deepest fears. It showed snarling, beast-like caricatures of Americans dragging away screaming Japanese women. The message was brutally simple. Your body, your dignity, and your soul would be violated. The fear was a physical presence, a constant companion in the humid air of the Pacific. It dictated every decision, fueling a collective resolve to choose suicide over the dishonor of capture. For Hana, the idea of an American was an abstraction of pure evil. She couldn't imagine a face, only a monstrous mask. She couldn't imagine a voice, only a guttural roar. This was the lens through which she saw the world, a world where honor was found only in death, and the ultimate terror was a foreign ship appearing on the horizon. The central conflict of her life, and the story of thousands like her, was not about to be fought on the battlefield with rifles and mortars, but in the quiet, terrified spaces of the mind, where deeply held certainties were about to collide with a shocking and unbelievable reality. The end came with the deafening roar of fire and steel. The American invasion of Saipan in June 1944 was a relentless, terrifying storm that shattered the island's defenses. For weeks, Hana and the others huddled in caves. The world outside reduced to the percussive thunder of artillery and the screams of the dying. The fortress of their minds, however, held strong. The terror of the shelling was secondary to the terror of what would come after. When the shelling finally stopped, and the strange alien shouts of English-speaking soldiers echoed into the mouth of their cave, the moment had arrived. This was it. The Oni had come for them. Clutching a small, crude grenade given to her for the sole purpose of self-destruction, Hana closed her eyes and waited for the end. She recited a prayer, her mind filled with the demonic faces from the posters. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat, cordite, and a palpable, collective fear. The soldiers' shadows fell over them, and the women braced for the brutal, inhuman violence they had been promised their entire lives. They expected claws and fangs, guttural roars, and sadistic glee. They were prepared for the absolute worst humanity could conceive of, a nightmare made real. The moment stretched into an eternity, a silent, trembling tableau of anticipated horror as the first American soldier stepped into the dim light of the cave. Hannah slowly opened her eyes, her knuckles white around the grenade. She flinched, not from a blow, but from sheer confusion. The creature standing before her was not a demon. It wasn't a monster. It was a man. And he was impossibly tall, taller than any Japanese man she had ever seen, with a straight posture and broad shoulders that seemed to fill the entire cave entrance. His face wasn't a twisted mask of rage, but was smeared with dirt and sweat. His expression one of exhaustion, not malice. His eyes, a startling shade of blue she had only ever seen in the deepest parts of the ocean, scanned the terrified group of women with something that looked bewilderingly like concern. He said something in his strange, melodic language, and it wasn't a roar. It was a sentence, spoken in a calm, low tone. Another soldier appeared behind him, equally tall and with a strong, handsome face that looked like it belonged on a movie poster, not in a bloody cave. He knelt and offered his canteen to a wounded woman nearby, moving with a gentleness that was utterly incomprehensible. It was a gesture so simple, so human, that it shattered Hannah's reality more effectively than any explosion. This was the first crack in the propaganda wall, a shock so profound it left her breathless. These weren't the beasts from the posters. They were just men, tall, handsome, and terrifyingly human. The days that followed were a disorienting blur of mounting cognitive dissonance. The women were gathered and led from the caves, not in chains or under the lash, but with a strange, almost businesslike procedure. They were processed, given medical attention, and herded toward the coast where transport ships waited. With every step, the indoctrinated reality of the Kichiku Beihei crumbled further. The American Marines, the very bogeymen of Imperial Japanese propaganda, were a constant source of shock. Their sheer size was the most immediate and striking feature. Most of the Japanese women stood barely shoulder-high to these giants from a distant land, but it was their behavior that was truly alien. They shared cigarettes, offered chocolate bars to the children who had been hiding with them, and made clumsy but clear efforts to communicate that they meant no harm. Hannah watched as a soldier with kind eyes and a square jaw spent 10 minutes patiently using hand gestures to explain to an elderly woman how to open a can of sea rations. This was not the behavior of savage demons. It was the behavior of people. As they boarded the massive ship that would take them to America, a new fear began to replace the old one. If the soldiers, the lowest-ranking members of this enemy nation, were like this, what would the rest of the country be like? The land of demons was turning out to be something else entirely, and they were now sailing straight into its heart. The voyage across the Pacific was a long, suspended moment of disbelief. Confined to the belly of the American transport ship, Hannah and the other women existed in a state of quiet, anxious observation. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Every expectation of cruelty was met with its opposite. They were not starved. They were given 3 meals a day. The food was strange: soft white bread, unfamiliar canned meats, and sweet, syrupy peaches. But it was plentiful. The water was clean, and medics regularly checked on the sick and wounded. The American sailors, young men mostly, kept a respectful distance but were not unkind. Hannah would watch them through the hatch, mesmerized by their casual confidence and easygoing nature. One blonde-haired sailor with a wide smile spent an afternoon teaching a small, orphaned Japanese boy how to play cat's cradle with a piece of string, their shared laughter echoing in the metallic corridors. A sound so innocent it felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught. These were not the actions of demons. Demons did not laugh with children. They did not show compassion. This consistent, relentless humanity was more psychologically destabilizing than any physical abuse would have been. It forced a question into her mind that she dared not speak aloud. If this part of the story was a lie, what else was? The first sight of America was not the fire-belching industrial hellscape depicted in the propaganda posters. It was the Golden Gate Bridge, emerging from a shroud of morning fog like something from a dream. As the ship sailed into San Francisco Bay, the women gathered on the deck, their silence a testament to their collective shock. Before them lay a city untouched by war, a breathtaking panorama of towering skyscrapers, elegant white houses climbing the hills, and countless cars moving like metallic beetles along wide, clean streets. There were no signs of the moral decay and desperation they had been promised. There were no starving masses or crumbling infrastructure. Instead, they saw a vision of impossible prosperity and power. The sheer scale of it was an assault on the senses. Everything was bigger, brighter, and newer than anything they had ever known. War-ravaged Japan was a world of scarcity, sacrifice, and gray, utilitarian survival. This America was a world of vibrant color, effortless abundance, and staggering, confident strength. Staring at the impossible city, Hana felt a profound sense of smallness, a feeling of having been lied to on a scale she could barely comprehend. The demons, it turned out, lived in paradise, and this realization was more terrifying than any monster she had ever imagined. The journey inland was a further descent into this bewildering new reality. The women were put on a train, and for days they watched America unfold through the window. The experience dismantled another core piece of propaganda, the idea of the weak, internally fractured American nation. The country was vast, an endless ocean of land that seemed to go on forever. They passed through sprawling, fertile farmlands where colossal machines harvested seas of golden wheat. They saw countless small towns, each with neat houses, green lawns, and a peaceful, orderly rhythm of life that seemed utterly alien. The people they glimpsed at the crossings were not the grotesque caricatures from the posters. They were ordinary, well-fed families. Hana watched a father teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle in a sun-drenched park. A scene of such simple, universal humanity that it brought an ache to her chest. This was the land she was taught to hate, the people she was meant to see as subhuman. But there was no weakness here. There was only an overwhelming sense of space, power, and an unshakable, deeply rooted stability. With every mile the train traveled, the psychological distance from her old life, her old certainties, grew exponentially, leaving her stranded in a wilderness of confusion. They finally arrived at their destination, Camp Haven, a prisoner of war facility nestled in the rolling plains of Nebraska. The name itself seemed like a cruel joke, and the women disembarked from the train expecting their ordeal to truly begin. They imagined barbed wire, cruel guards, and starvation rations. But Camp Haven was not the death camp of their nightmares. It was a collection of clean, sturdy wooden barracks, a fully staffed medical clinic, a library, and even a small store. They were assigned quarters, given fresh clothing, and told the rules through a Japanese-American translator, a Nisei woman whose calm professionalism was yet another source of disorientation. One afternoon, Hana came down with a severe fever. She was taken to the infirmary, convinced she would be left to die. Instead, she was met by a tall, stern-looking American doctor. In a reconstructed diary entry, she might have written, "He had a sharp face and cold, gray eyes. I thought he would look at me like an insect, but his hands were gentle as he examined me. He spoke to the nurse in a low, serious voice, and for 3 days she brought me medicine and warm broth. On the 4th day, the doctor returned and placed his cool hand on my forehead. He gave a small, tired smile and said one of the few English words I knew, 'Good.' Why would a demon save my life? Why show such care for an enemy?" This simple act of medical professionalism and basic human decency was a direct, undeniable contradiction to a lifetime of indoctrination. The turning point wasn't a single event, but a slow, crushing avalanche of evidence. It was the accumulation of countless small moments. The guards sharing their own rations, the unexpected kindness of a camp nurse, the sheer, undeniable prosperity of the nation they were supposed to despise. The entire edifice of their worldview, built by years of relentless, state-sponsored propaganda, had been proven undeniably, catastrophically wrong. The Americans were not monsters, they were just people. This simple truth was the most devastating revelation of all, for it carried with it a terrifying corollary. Their leaders, their emperor, their entire nation had lied to them. They had been sent to die, or to kill themselves based on a complete and utter fabrication. The sense of betrayal was a void that opened up beneath them, swallowing everything they once held sacred: honor, duty, and the righteousness of their cause. Their sacrifice was not noble, it was based on a falsehood. Their certainties had collapsed, leaving them not as proud soldiers of the empire, but as lost and bewildered women, adrift in the heart of an enemy nation that was proving to be more humane than their own. How do you rebuild your identity when you discover its very foundation is a lie? The emotional climax arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating whisper that passed between the women in the barracks of Camp Haven. The shared glances of confusion had slowly evolved into hushed, furtive conversations. One woman would speak of the kindness of a particular guard who had shared a photo of his family. Another would describe the meticulous care a doctor had taken to set her broken arm. Each story was another piece of evidence, another confirmation that their experiences were not unique delusions, but part of a shared, undeniable reality. The shame they felt was immense, but it had inverted. It was no longer the shame of capture, the dishonor they had been taught to fear more than death. It was the deeper, more corrosive shame of having been so completely and utterly fooled. This was followed by a slow-burning anger, not at their captors, but at their own leaders. And beneath it all was a profound, aching grief for the dead. They thought of their friends and sisters on Saipan, the ones who had chosen the grenade or the cliff's edge, dying in terror of monsters that never existed. Their noble sacrifice, their gyokusai, now seemed like a tragic, pointless waste, orchestrated by a lie. This realization was a psychological poison, dismantling their sense of purpose, honor, and national identity from the inside out. The core realization extended beyond the character of the American soldiers to the very nature of America itself. Living inside the belly of the beast, the women became unwilling students of its power. They observed the camp's logistics with a growing sense of awe and dread. Every day, trucks arrived laden with supplies. Food was abundant, a seemingly endless river of flour, meat, and vegetables. Medical equipment was modern and plentiful. Even the prisoners' clothing was sturdy and new. Hana and the others, who came from a nation of extreme rationing, where every scrap of metal was being collected for the war effort and civilians were subsisting on meager portions, could not comprehend this level of effortless abundance. It dawned on them that this camp, a trivial backwater in the grand scheme of the American war effort, was better supplied than most frontline Japanese army divisions. They finally understood that Japan wasn't just fighting an army of tall, healthy men. It was fighting a system, a colossal engine of production and logistics that could wage a world war without its own citizens even feeling the pinch. The propaganda had told them the Americans were spiritually weak, but here was the evidence that their material strength was beyond anything Japan could ever hope to match. The war, they now knew, was already lost. One evening, speaking with the quiet Nisei translator, a woman named Esther, Hana finally gave voice to the transformation that had taken place within her. This became her confession. Before, Hannah began, her voice barely audible, I prayed every day for the destruction of your country. I believed every American was a demon. When the soldiers came to the cave, I held a grenade in my hands and was ready to die rather than be touched by one of you. I truly believed you were monsters. I looked at the soldiers, so tall and strong, and I felt nothing but hatred and terror. She paused, looking down at her hands. Now, I see the truth. The guard at the gate, Sergeant Miller. He talks about his daughter, who is my age, the doctor who saved me from the fever. He was just a man doing his job. We receive more food in a day here than my family in Osaka gets in a week. Everything I was taught was a lie, a cruel lie. My friends died because of it. They threw themselves from the cliffs, clutching their babies. For nothing. Tears streamed down her face. Tears not of fear, but of a grief so profound it felt like it could swallow the world. I don't know who I am anymore. If I am not a daughter of the Emperor, what am I? I am just a ghost, haunted by a foolish belief. This confession crystallized the new, horrifying worldview that had replaced the old one. The lie was not simply a tool to inspire fighting spirit. It was a carefully constructed veil to hide the impossible truth of America's power. The propaganda had a dual purpose. It was designed to make them hate the enemy, but more importantly, it was designed to prevent them from understanding the enemy. To see the American soldier as a grotesque, subhuman beast was to dismiss him as a credible threat. But to see him as a tall, healthy, well-equipped man was to see him as the end product of a superior system, a system that could produce millions of such men. The handsome faces and powerful physiques of their captors were no longer just a superficial shock. They were a symbol. They symbolized a nation that could afford to feed its people, to invest in their health, to build them up. They were living, breathing monuments to the industrial, agricultural, and logistical supremacy of the United States. The lie was a strategic necessity for the Japanese leadership, a desperate attempt to shield the nation's psyche from the demoralizing reality that they had picked a fight with a giant, and their cause was utterly, hopelessly doomed from the start. The psychological climax for Hannah and the other women was this final, silent acceptance. Their old world was dead, burned to ash by the truth. Their identity as loyal subjects of a divine emperor fighting a holy war against demonic forces had been annihilated. They were no longer soldiers or patriots in any meaningful sense. They were simply survivors, adrift on a sea of shattered beliefs. The greatest battle of their lives was not fought on the shores of Saipan, but in the quiet barracks of Nebraska, and it was a battle for their own sanity. They had to construct a new reality from the wreckage of the old one, a world in which their sacrifices were meaningless and their sworn enemy was humane. This was a profoundly isolating realization. They were witnesses to a truth that their families and countrymen back home could not and would not believe. They were ghosts of a war that was still raging, a war they now knew their side could never win. What would you do if you discovered the sacred cause you were willing to die for was built on a deliberate, calculated lie? It's a question that forces a person to either break completely or be reborn into something entirely new. When the news of Japan's unconditional surrender reached Camp Haven in August 1945, it was met not with the shock and disbelief that convulsed their homeland, but with a quiet, somber sense of inevitability. For Hannah and the other women, the war had ended months ago, not with the atomic bomb, but with the sight of a prosperous America and the simple human kindness of its people. They had been living the conclusion of the story long before it was officially written. The journey home was a reverse image of their journey to America. They sailed back across the Pacific not as soldiers of a divine empire, but as something far more complicated. Witnesses. They returned to a nation they no longer recognized, a landscape of scorched cities and hollow-eyed survivors. Here, the lie they had escaped from still held sway in its death throes, with many civilians believing the surrender was a temporary truce before a final, glorious battle on home soil. The women, with their first-hand knowledge of the enemy's true strength and character, became aliens in their own country, keepers of a truth too painful and disillusioning for most to bear. They couldn't share their stories openly, for who would believe that the demonic Kichiku Beihei were actually just tall, handsome, and shockingly decent men? Their knowledge was a silent burden, isolating them in the very homes they had longed to see again. The lasting legacy of these women, and the thousands of other Japanese prisoners of war who shared a similar experience, is a quiet but crucial thread in the fabric of post-war reconciliation. Their stories, though often confined to private conversations and hushed family circles, became a counter-narrative to the decades of militaristic propaganda. They were the first seeds of a new understanding. When the American occupation began, the Japanese population expected the same brutality their own soldiers had inflicted elsewhere. But the occupiers, by and large, did not behave like monsters, a fact that baffled the general populace but made perfect sense to the former POWs. These returning women were uniquely equipped to understand the peaceful and constructive nature of the American presence. They had already seen the human face of their former enemy. This first-hand knowledge, multiplied across thousands of repatriated prisoners, helped to subtly soften the ground for one of the most successful and peaceful post-war occupations in modern history. They became inadvertent ambassadors for a reality their government had tried desperately to hide, proving that even in the wake of total war, direct human experience can build a bridge where propaganda had sought to dig an uncrossable chasm. Their journey into the demon's land ultimately helped their own nation find a new path forward. In the end, this is more than a story about female Japanese prisoners of war. It is a timeless lesson about the terrifying power of state-sponsored narrative and the profound revolutionary force of individual human experience. It reveals that the most critical theater of war is often the human mind, and the most effective weapon is not always a bomb, but a meticulously crafted lie. Propaganda builds walls between people, transforming neighbors into monsters and acts of war into sacred duties. It functions by creating an abstraction of evil, a caricature so vile it invites annihilation. But these walls, no matter how thick, can be instantly demolished by a single authentic human gesture. An offered canteen of water, a shared piece of chocolate, a doctor's gentle care. The story of Hana and the women of Saipan is a stark reminder that the ultimate truth of any conflict is never found in the rhetoric of leaders or the hatred on a poster. It is found in the simple, undeniable, and often shocking recognition of humanity in the face of the enemy. It proves that the most powerful force on earth is not ideology, but empathy, and that the tallest walls of hatred can crumble to dust when we are forced to simply look our demons in the eye and see ourselves.